Hey there, spiritualpreneurs. Welcome to our podcast where we talk about all things mental health and spirituality.
That's right. We're your hosts, Biani and Sequoia, and we're here to provide you with the tools, tips, and insights to help you navigate your spiritual journey and maintain your mental wellness.
As millennials, we understand the unique challenges that come with balancing our spiritual practices with our everyday lives. From managing our careers to building relationships, it can be tough to find the time and energy to prioritize our mental and spiritual health.
But that's where we come in. Each episode, we'll be sharing our personal experiences, interviewing experts in the field, and exploring different spiritual practices to support you and ourselves on this journey of unlearning from mental health programs, incorporating spirituality, and embodying our identities as spiritualpreneurs.
So, whether you're a seasoned spiritualpreneur or just starting out on your journey, this podcast is for you. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to elevate your mental health and spiritual well being.
Let's get started.
So excited about the topic today, excited about the panelists, excited to see, where we go. And intersectionality and spiritual bypassing are topics that we've discussed related to spiritual therapists and their practices. And we wanted to chat more on how practitioners are reflecting on the political aspects of spirituality. In this episode of our Spiritual Practitioners Answer series, we discuss our experiences, perspectives, and answer the question why or how is the spiritual political? We are honored to welcome our guest panelists and fellow spiritual practitioners and social workers, Michelle Jaquish and Erin Fairchild, for this important conversation. You're muted, Biani. It's okay. You're still muted. There you go.
Y'all, this
It's
is the
okay.
funniest thing because okay, Mercury, welcome Mercury
Mercury, I
too.
was about to say, listen, y'all don't
Welcome to
even know the
Planet Mercury.
conversation
The stuff
we've
that
had
Sequoia and
before
I.
getting on this stream about Mercury retrograde, okay?
Okay, welcome y'all and welcome Mercury. Okay, Reclaiming Soul Work is a heart-centered podcast by two queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, mental health, and everything in between. My name is Biani, also known as Mercury, clearly, because Mercury is here, alive, and showing us all the ways. Um, my pronouns are she, ella, they. I am Black, I'm Dominican, I'm queer, non binary femme, I'm a mama, I'm a therapist in private practice, a tarot practitioner, and just all the things related to spirituality and mental wellness. And yeah, I live, play, and work in Lenape-Hoking, also called Philadelphia. Um, and, you know, Mercury's just doing its thing. Mercury's in reggaeton, So I got to dance with Mercury instead of trying to resist it. My sun sign is Virgo. That's why I'm laughing a little bit because for my little astro friends and babes tuning in, Virgo is ruled by Mercury. So Mercury is always fun when it's in retrograde for me. Not true. It's not fun. But my rising is Cancer and my moon is in Aries. And yeah, just happy to be here and surrendering to all the wisdom that Mercury has right now. Because y'all, thank you for being here. But us getting here was hilarious. How about you, my friend?
That is the truth. Oh my goodness. Hi everyone. My name is Sequoia. I use she and her pronouns. Um, I live and work in Anchorage, Alaska on Dena'ina land. You're very grateful. Um, and let's see, I identify as a Black queer therapist, artist, um, And I really enjoy being on this podcast with Biani. And, now that we've been able to open the platform for other folks to come on, I just kind of wanted to say in my introduction, how much I value um, folks for their time, when they come on and talk to us, but then also folks sharing and reposting and sending the links and emails and text messages and all the things. We're really grateful for that. So I just wanted to take a moment to say that um, I am an Aquarius sun, an Aries moon, and a Libra rising. I have a white little mini schnauzer named Winnie. Winnie like Mandela, not Pooh. Um, and I think that's all that I want to say today related to the introduction. Um, yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that. Shall I just go right into introducing folks, Biani? Is it anything?
Sorry, my mute button is working again. No, I think that feels good. Yeah, we're really grateful. And, we also had like our 1 year kind of anniversary recording the podcast. So shout out to us and shout out to all of you who've been tuning in and you've been on the for those who've been on the journey from the beginning and those who are joining us now, welcome. Thank you for being
Yes.
here. We're happy to have you. And yeah, that's all I got. I'd love to introduce or introduce our guests.
Cool. Let's do that then. All right. We are at the place where we introduce our panelists, and we're going to start with Erin Fairchild. She uses she and her pronouns, and Erin is the founder of Journal as Alter and Collective Action Consulting. She has been making meaning through journaling and paper craft practices since she was tiny, nourishing her spirit and uncovering her creative voice. A few years back, Erin realized that her journals acted as altars in her life, and that felt powerful. Journal as Alter was born. Erin is also a social worker and former therapist with expertise related to childhood trauma, attachment, and preventing violence in systems, communities, and families. In addition to Journal as Alter, Erin continues to work in the fields of equity centered trauma informed care and violence prevention over at Collective Action Consulting. Erin knows that your journals can hold you, but they hold nothing against you. All right. I love that. Okay. So let's move on to our second panelist, Michelle Jaquish. Michelle doesn't consider themselves a very traditional therapist. Michelle is the owner of Banshee Therapy Services, where they work collaboratively with clients, bringing their authentic self into the room while letting clients take the lead in their lives. Michelle graduated with a Master's of Social Work and a Bachelor's of Art from the University of Washington in Seattle. During their time as a graduate student, Michelle received a Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship in the Southeast Asian Studies Department, which allowed them to learn their mother's native language of Tagalog to prepare for a human rights trip to the Philippines. She has 5 years of community mental health experience in homeless crisis services in Seattle, and both in direct service and supervisory roles from a person centered harm reduction focus. Shortly, Biani and I are going to welcome our two panelists into the stream, and then we're going to hop right into this conversation. But we just wanted to really quickly recenter, why are we talking about this again, right? Because episode one, I believe it was, Biani mentioned, is titled The Spiritual is Political. And now here we are talking to panelists about this same topic. So why are we circling back?
And I love that we're circling back episode 17, right? From episode 1 to episode 17. So, there's so many reasons why we believe as who we are, we share our identities, that the spiritual is political, right? The spiritual can be personal, the spiritual is collective. That makes the spiritual political. And we both feel really strongly about that. Um, and so we really wanted to bring other voices into the fold to have a real conversation about why the spiritual is political and how, right? Like, how does it look? So many folks have asked, right? Like, we hear a lot about the spiritual being political, but what does it look like? And, for us, the truth of it is that we want to invite people to make space for like paying attention to like spiritual bypassing and the harm that it does in our communities and the folks that we serve. And to also hold that the spiritual belongs in our work as spiritual entrepreneurs and practitioners. So it needs to be looked through a political lens too. Like it can't be like separate. It's all connected. It's all interconnected. We are all spiritual beings, whether we like, and it's not about being religious, right? It's about the fact that we are all a part of the system. We're all interconnected. We're part of this big ecosystem. And we're also a part of a political system, and they're all interconnected. So for us, we assume that the spiritual is political.
Mhm.
What about you?
Yeah, I love that explanation, and it also reminds me of a live stream that we did on intersectionality. Because for me, when I see the phrase or when I think about the spiritual being political and exactly what you just mentioned, Biani, about the interconnectedness, I also go, and it's so amazing that we have two social workers today. I always go back to this piece on a holistic approach to really look at folks and support folks in the community. Um, I feel like the spiritual is political in the social work context, meaning I don't like the separations of micro, meso, macro. I feel like the spiritual is political in the sense of advocating for the connections between those things, not separating those things, having social workers understand that, a specialty in one area does not mean that specialty, the other areas don't come in, and influence the work that you're doing. Um, so like that's one way that I think about it. I was also looking at some of my talking points, and I also think about the spiritual is political, from some other intersections too. And if we think about like this divination piece, I think about it from the perspective of, advocating about divine feminine and masculine readings and how I feel like that's really transphobic and homophobic, I also have here like looking at, I don't like, or let me say it like this. On TikTok, I went back and forth a little bit in the comment section of a relatively well-known tarot reader because they were pushing attachment theory, right? Which is fine. We see that happen with a lot of spiritualists. But the spiritual is political from my perspective related to that particular example, because I see a lot of spiritual divination people like on YouTube, TikTok, and so on, pushing theories that therapists, Black and Brown therapists, either do not or approach it from a more decolonized way. And I just use attachment theory as an example. This tarot reader did not want to hear, that attachment theory is rooted in white supremacy. And if you don't decolonize that for yourself, so on and so forth. So that's I just a little snippet of, maybe some of the things that we'll get into, but that's kind of how I view this topic.
I love that and yes, y'all should check out our IG live because that was an incredible live about intersectionality. I mean, it's also about the frame, right? Like, what is the frame that guides your work? And spirituality is not void of that. Like, we also have to be responsible as spiritual practitioners not to cause harm and not to perpetuate the harm we claim we're against. And so we do that by not being survivor centered, by not being trauma informed. We do that by perpetuating harm, being transphobic, homophobic, making assumptions about people. You know what I mean? Like, we do that in our work too. And it's really important for us. We've said this many times, but it is really important to like also examine and unlearn a lot of the spiritual practices that we may appropriate, because a lot of times we're appropriating it, or we're not conscious. We're not conscious of the language we're using. And yeah, I think that conversation around tarot is really important in divination, or even about some of the spiritual practices that people might, put into practice, like inviting some awareness. Like, why do you practice that modality? Like, where does it come from? Is it yours to like practice? Do we have permission? Or, like learning the history, or trying to, and being honest. Like, it's also about really unlearning. It's really rooted in unlearning. But yeah, we can keep going. Just give
And we
me a little
will, but with
tease.
our panelists.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
and we will, but with our panelists. So I think that's an amazing segue to just bring them on in. And let's get to talking. Okay. So let's welcome everybody in. Okay. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Erin. Thank you all for being here. Okay. Biani and I introduced you all. We also just gave a little bit more context for, why we chose this topic, why we're continuing to talk about, why or how the spiritual is political. We mentioned that, our episode 1 is named The Spiritual is Political. We also had a live IG chat where we talked about intersectionality. And so, yeah, I think that was, again, just an amazing way to bring y'all in. And we would love if you all would just tell us a little bit about yourselves. And as mentioned, please, this is, an open conversation. So whoever wants to hop right in, please do.
Hi, Michelle. It's so good to be here. Biani Sequoia, nice to meet you again, Erin. I am a therapist. I'm also a social worker. Found this podcast last year in the middle of the pandemic, which is the medicine I needed. And let's see, how do I approach therapy? I approach it as authentically as I can, which means I use a lot of my lived experience, self-disclosure, right? Like, which I was told in graduate school you're not supposed to do. But in the time of pandemic and serving BIPOC folks, that's what they want to hear. They want to hear it from someone that's been through it. Yeah, I've been through some traumas in my childhood. I've dealt with racism and sexism, both in our profession and in other spaces. And I think it's important to tell those stories and bring them to the light, right? Like, trauma is often stories of silence. And when we bring them to the light, that's where we can start healing from them. Um, what else? I also use tarot in my therapy practice and taught one training, which I might get into later, because that got some heat. It was an interesting time, but I draw cards for clients at the end of session or in the beginning of session if they're struggling with what to talk about or a bit shy. A lot of the decks I use have like queer folks of color, folks of different abilities, skin tones, body types. I'm I'm not a huge fan of the Rider Waite Smith. I know it's like my first tarot deck I ever had, but it's not my favorite one. And I like using ones that have more kind of like activist diversity in them. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Erin, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. It is such a joy and an honor to be in this space with all of you. I'm excited to get to know you more, Michelle, through this conversation and for this podcast and all the work that you, Sequoia, and Biani do. I'm just grateful the way that you show up and what you share with us. And it's so generous and gracious. I think the amount that you share around learning and support. So I'm just super happy to be here. And thank you for having me. Let's see. So I am white and I am in an active lifelong relationship with what it looks like to not identify with whiteness. I can't ever deny my white skin or the privilege that it brings me, but I always like to just remind myself when I have conversations about identity that I'm just in a lifelong relationship. And I say relationship because there's no destination or endpoint. It's shifting all the time, but just in a constant, intimate conversation with myself and other white folks around what it means to disavow whiteness or betray whiteness in ways that we can. And so that also intersects with my queer identity in many ways. My queer identity, often interesting, speaking of intersectionality, that often folks interpret me as straight because my gender kind of matches whatever, the quote unquote assignment is. And so unless I'm with my partner who doesn't conform so much to rigid gender norms, I'm often read as straight. So it's interesting to be in that space. I'm fat, and that's part of my life and my experience. I'm a survivor. And I love being in conversation with folks who are able to bring trauma to light, like you said, Michelle, and to make space and to normalize it, and to really, for me, dig into how our identities and the way our identities get treated in society speak to our ability to heal and recover in many, many ways. So I'm just super excited to be here. And I used to be a therapist. I'm not practicing anymore, but I wanted to say, Michelle, though when I was a therapist, I was mostly a child therapist, although child and family, because I think good therapy for children needs to be with primary caregivers for it to really matter and show up. And when I was in therapy for, off and on many years of my life, my favorite therapist used Tarot with me. So for those of you who are using Tarot, that's like super helpful to me in my healing. And so I'm always excited when I hear people bringing that in. And then, as mentioned, my creative practice, primarily around journaling and anything that has to do with pens and paper and paints and markers, is a huge part of my life and always has been. And I incorporate a lot of those processes with people who are in healing and recovery journeys over the years. And I also focus a lot on preventing violence before it happens in my work. So I'll stop there.
That was amazing. Thank you all so much for just sharing more about yourselves. It sounds like, we had gotten into a little bit of what inspired each of us to kind of get into this work. I hear a lot of overlapping like themes with lived experience, around a lot of different topics. And so, yeah, I would love to just talk a little bit more about even you all being at this place, having your own practice, what that has looked like for you. Um, Michelle, you mentioned the panini. I can only imagine, like the shifts and things that happened during that time, right? And I know for us, well, let me say, and I'll focus on for myself the podcast, and I again, Michelle, I appreciate, you mentioning that because Biani and I coming together on the podcast was around like we want to build community. We want other folks in community that not only use like divination, but creative expression types of uh, interventions, right, with folks. And yeah, and then the podcast happened. And for me, I wanted to be in community, with other therapists that were incorporating divination. Um, and so here we are. Biani, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or if somebody else wants to hop in,
Well,
please.
yeah, I think I appreciate you sharing that because I'm feeling like there's this thread in the ways that like our spiritual practices, like all of us here, like really intersect with the political. Like it's really driven by like our values, and then like it shows up in our work. Everybody kind of shared their own way of like how it shows up in the work, how we politicize this work. Um, and I I met Erin actually during the Panini. Erin had this really cool offering, and I'm sure she'll share later on. Um, but to Sequoia's point was that for me, I was really craving like creative practices that were really like connected to spirit, were intersectional, were political, like just weaved in all the things that I felt really mattered. And I felt really lucky that I got to meet Sequoia and we birthed this podcast together with that vision in mind. And, like this idea of like the spiritual being political, for me, sometimes it's hard to explain because it just is, like I'm a queer Black feminist, like my lineage is connected to these Black feminists who raised me through their words, right? And their practices. And So for me, the spiritual was never like disconnected from the political. It just, I don't even know what that looks like. And yet I'm bombarded with it everywhere I go, right? Like where a lot of people really exploit spiritual practices and use it as a tool to cause a lot of harm. And so just hearing what y'all are talking about right now, just even in your work, right? Like even the idea that somebody's journal can be an altar, that can be a place that transforms how they relate to themselves and their community. And the same thing with Michelle, like you're like, hey, I bring tarot into this work. And I really feel like self-disclosure is a healing and political tool, right? Like that alone, I mean, that doesn't feel like a big deal to some people, but I want to slow us down to like, let's just remind people who are tuning in, like that is courageous work. That is a lot of work of unlearning and doing that inner work too. And it feels really important because it's not modeled in our training and in these programs. And so we have to like deprogram, decolonize, unlearn to really be able to make decisions about, no, I'm going to show up for the folks that I'm in service to as authentic as I can and as aligned to freedom as possible, you know, and that's daily. So, you know, that's where I'll stop. But if anybody else wants to share or
I love what you said, because I brought one of my tarot decks with me that I wanted to show an image from, if that's okay. It's from the Kapwa tarot deck, which Kapwa means like interconnectedness, collectivism, which is like really hard to talk about as a mental health therapist because all of our theories from grad school are very individualistic. And I'm Filipino and we were a collectivist culture before colonization happened. So I'm trying to reclaim that for myself and with the clients I work with. But before therapists and like mental health workers, there were healers, especially in my lineage. And the card I want to show, I'm able to see it, is this deck's version of the High Priestess, which is called the Babaylan, which were the queer, femme, trans, like indigenous healers, knew everything about plants, would hold space for people, knew medicine. Um, they were femme, you know. And I will go back to this image a lot because there's a lot of power in just like the way that this like figure is standing and in the center of the image. It's, you know, there's some like yonic looking things going on in there. There's a crocodile at the bottom, and there's this myth that like the colonizers fed these healers to the crocodiles thinking that they could get rid of them, but what they did was they integrated with the crocodile and just got rebirth that way. And these like stories of rebirth and reclaiming are just like so important in therapy work and any kind of healing work, and that's just like the way I like to approach that. And I think, like you said earlier, Biani, you can't really disentangle spirituality with like mental health. Like you just can't. And you know, it's images like this and showing that in like session with clients. Yeah.
I love that, Michelle. Thank you so much for sharing, with us. That tarot card looks amazing. That was a beautiful image. I felt like I kind of got lost in it a little bit. Um, so I can only imagine what the rest of the deck looks like. Um, Thank you so much. Yeah, I like why this conversation is so important, that's making its way into the space now, which I think is great, because these connections to again, not only lived experience, but they're also these pieces about identity I think are so important. I think social work is a very interesting field where it was absolutely discouraged, for us to share anything about ourselves, and as you all have mentioned, that was such the kind of opposite of what I knew to relationship building. and like rapport and things like that. Like I always found that very strange how I couldn't share anything about myself, but I needed to build trust, build rapport, and things like that with folks around very difficult and challenging, trauma and incidents and so on and so forth. So I feel like, showing up integrated and being able to process appropriately, with folks, that's the political aspect to it, right? Because to me, anything that is the opposite of white supremacy or, individual type thinking related to mental health, healing, it is political.
I, Michelle, I appreciate you sharing the tarot deck. I've seen that tarot deck circulate in the tarot community, and I love the story. And I'm really struck with this idea of thinking about the colonizer trying to like do away with the entire community or collective, and it only made that person stronger, or made the community stronger, and integration and the metamorphosis. And so I'm really struck with that. I'm really staying with that. I love that. Um, and I'm just thinking, I'm curious about, for y'all, like, why do you feel like this conversation is really important for us to have right now? Like, I would love to hear from y'all around, like, why is the spiritual political conversation important? Like, why do we need to center this right now? And I kind of feel like, Michelle, you kind of got us, you started us there with that beautiful story that's a part of your lineage. And just thinking about how important stories are to keep keep the truth alive too, to be honest, because we know a lot of the project of supremacy culture and oppression and colonization is to keep the lies active, right? Like, it's to keep stories that actually aren't true that we tend to believe, But anywho, yeah, let us know. Like, would love to hear from y'all. Why do you think this conversation is important right now?
Michelle, thank you for sharing that card and the meaning. I feel like it was such a good grounding for this conversation today, and just into the future, I'll carry it with me. I think I've been thinking about this a lot. I think about it a lot all the time, but then in preparation for this conversation, to me and my practice and just to my being human experience, there really is, other than, well, it's actually even connected. There is nothing more important to me than the spiritual is political and the political is spiritual. It's because it is such a foundation for how I have to navigate this life. And I almost was going to say, well, maybe second to my love relationships. And you know what, though? The spiritual is political is so present in my love relationships. It's so related. And I think in particular for, I speak often, it's my practice to speak about my experience with whiteness and being socialized into a white body and what that means, and what it means to be in this space with all of you and with other spaces I occupy, is that, even saying that I do work related to trauma-informed care and attachment is highly political, because when I go into the world and social work spaces where people are expecting trauma-informed care and attachment to be one thing. And when I work with people, I make it clear that I will not have a conversation as a trainer, as a consultant, as a technical assistance provider, as someone who's building curriculums and programs with you, unless you're willing to talk about how experiences with oppression are a form of trauma, and how whiteness itself is dominating all of our systems. And if we're not unlearning as white practitioners, then we're probably perpetuating trauma. And so, it is this political thing, because inherently bringing that in makes it political. And what's deeper underlying that to me is deeply spiritual, because I would say that for me, I came to the political aspect of identity and social justice before I came to the spiritual. So for me, the politics, and just honestly, like when I found social justice, when I learned about intersectionality, and I had the opportunity to learn from so many, particularly women of color in college, and then reading and beyond, that to me was like the politics of that opened my world in a way that really changed everything for me. And it was inherently political. And I think the spiritual component came later, when I realized that I needed to make some meaning to survive this, right? To to survive all of the identities and all of the ways the world is trying to crush us. And even when you spoke earlier, Sequoia, about the micro, meso, macro, that really spoke to me, because that's just so much whiteness. I think, don't get me started about adverse childhood experiences and ACEs and whiteness. That's a whole other thing. And we're not supposed to bring ourselves into our spaces as practitioners, as healers, as teachers, is also, as you already said, so rooted in whiteness. And what it really says to me, and then I'll pause, but to me, this is one of the biggest spiritual learnings of my whole life, and it's so political, is that whiteness and white supremacy and capitalism and white dominant social work wants us to remain in a savior place where we reach hands down to people and tell them what they need to do to be successful. And that requires us to not integrate our own pain, our own suffering, our own shadow into that work in a substantial way. And that just will always recenter whiteness, right? Every time we're like, no matter who you are, if you're like, I'm not on the same plane as you, I'm somehow above you, and I know I'm going to give you advice, and my experiences don't matter to this conversation. It feels a lot like a lot of misinformed and misguided and still rooted in white supremacy anti-racist strategy, right? Which is like, oh, I'll help you. I want you to have what I have, so I'll make this equal by doing this, instead of stepping back and seeing how whiteness and white supremacy is hurting all of us. Maybe it hurts me last, and it's still hurting all of us.
Points were made. Points were made.
I
Points
kept,
were
just in case the mute didn't capture that.
yes. That I think that we are just all in this very interesting shift around what's important, recentering values, really understanding the insidious aspects to, you know, um, whiteness, white supremacy. I really appreciate, you bringing the word savior into this conversation too, Erin, because social work, just has a lot of decolonizing around that, very much still. And so, yeah, I feel like as we kind of shift into this next question about how do you see spirituality and the political as interconnected, I think that we've had some wonderful like little gems just drop, so far about how we see those connections, not only, that micro, meso, macro connection, but also this lived experience, identity piece, you know. Um, how else are you all kind of thinking about seeing these two things connected?
Um, Makes me think a lot about when I was actually in the Philippines and got to do some activism. Like, I remember going to this human rights conference, and then there was like a little march outside the venue because there was like a displaced like native community just like didn't have anywhere to go. It was just like post and shop, like similar to like encampments in the Seattle area, the homeless encampments that are happening. And I remember going to this march, and like it was hot. I had I like had this skirt on, but I could feel the mosquitoes just biting me everywhere. And like I had welts from the mosquito bites the day before, and then I just had more. And I was just like, I did nothing but break down in tears. Like I was on this trip for 3 weeks, and that was like the halfway point, and I was just like silent the whole time, taking all this information in, learning from different like activists doing like really intense work. And I was just like, I'm gonna cry. So I started crying. Everybody was like, are you okay? We're here with you. And I was just like, all I can think about is how much these mosquito bites hurt. And I can't believe like I'm feeling very selfish and thinking about this right now when I'm literally in the middle of activism. And I think about that story a lot because at the time I thought I was selfish, but looking back, I'm like, no, that was like the first time I realized my humanity as an activist in this work is like it's painful. Like, it's not easy to see people displaced like that and like not have access to the stories as a Filipino American that didn't get to grow up in the Philippines, to that knowledge and having to learn it through like, educational white supremacist systems. I mean, I'm glad I got that knowledge, but the fact that I had to use those institutions for it was rough. Um, and I tell this story a lot when I do like public speaking gigs in like mental health like work or therapy work, because there's something about the somatic idea of getting like bit by mosquitoes that like wakes you up, right? And I feel like in the last 3 years, all of us have had so many wake up calls about how just terrible things are and that they like need to change. And so that's why I think it's so important to integrate, like, there was a spiritual aspect, right? I'm learning my culture and my knowledge. And then there's this activist piece, right? I'm not just here for myself, I'm here for like collective.
I I just feel like something just opened inside of me around thinking about spirituality in this expansive way, um, because something that I've thought about and is around like spirituality, like a love ethic. And Erin and I have talked about this, like, yeah, but like the idea that a love ethic, like I think about Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and their definition of a love ethic, to me being like deeply spiritual and deeply political, thinking about the Black femme healers, the BIPOC women and femmes, who I consider a part of my like intellectual or spiritual and cultural lineage, how they support me. Like, and really what keeps me in this work is love. It's love. And to me, that's spiritual and political, because love is political too. Like the reason we're in this work is because of love. Love and liberation are the same, and I think so many times I've been really frustrated in political spaces that are devoid of spirituality. And then I've been frustrated in spiritual spaces that are devoid of like a political lens. And this binary, being caught up in this illusory binary as a non-binary femme, like often being like, especially in political spaces, at least in the 2000s, just being really frustrated with the lack of like some type of grounding. And to me, when I think about spirituality, I'm thinking about being trauma informed. I'm thinking about creativity, because creativity is deeply spiritual, right? I'm thinking about what it's like to be interconnected, that we're not separate, that we are all connected, that Sequoia's pain is my pain, and that Michelle's joy is my joy. Like that's not separate. Just like Michelle's liberation is deeply intertwined to mine. So how can we continue to like create this like made up binary around the spiritual and the political when we are all deeply connected? And I actually like what you said, Erin. You were like, it might hurt me last, but it still hurts, right? Like supremacy culture hurts all of us. And the order of it, sure. Like, yeah, they're going to come for you too. Like, they might not come for you first, but they're going to come for you too. So why are we not, it's just like that interconnectedness and just, yeah. So.
Yeah, this conversation just feels, it's like intriguing and it's sparking so many things, and it also feels really nourishing. So thank you. Because it's unique to get to be able to integrate all of the parts of myself and maybe, all the parts of ourselves in this way. So I'm really appreciating that. And, I think I'm thinking so much from what you said, building off what all of you have said, and particularly what I think I see happening around spirituality and whiteness and white people right now in particular. I mean, there's always new versions of this actually throughout history of white folks doing this. But right now we're at a fever pitch. You mentioned Sequoia, what's happening on TikTok and Instagram and social media. There is just this extreme onslaught of white people selling high ticket classes, courses, coaching, counseling, even though therapy, they may not be, licensure is a whole other thing. I'm not saying that licensure means you're qualified, but with no accountability structure, let's just say, and doing so from a very, and really hyping the spiritual aspect. And then there's this onslaught of linking spirituality with wealth and with like money wealth, with like the more you have, the more spiritual you are, right? Which is such a white capitalist thing. Like, how do we even get there? Like the conflation of wealth with spiritual enlightenment is really proliferating right now, and it's really dangerous and painful. And I just feel that why it's so important to my practice, if I'm going to speak to spirituality, a lot of my audience on social media, not all of it, but a fair amount of my audience for Journal is Altar in particular, are white women who are creators. No, it's not, I mean, there's a pretty diverse crew, and there's a lot of white women. And so there's no way that I could ever speak to anything about spirituality and not bring identity and politics into it. I also think that for me, it is this intersection of politics and spirituality that makes me always want to do an intervention on the concept of self-care, as white women have kind of overtaken the idea and made it about what you buy, how much free time you have, how much time you have away from children, caregiving, working, all of these concepts that to me are antithetical to what is spiritual to me, right? And I think that deep down, about when it, again, I can only speak to whiteness because that's my experience in this world, but I do think that one of the features of whiteness is to separate us from a deeper spirituality, because the deeper we are in our spiritual knowing, the more in touch we are with our humanity. And you can't keep treating people the way that we are treating them and be in touch with your humanity. So I think it is by design that spirituality for white people right now is about buying and consuming and flaunting wealth, because we get to feel enlightened, but it's fake, and it allows us to still have power over people. And also to honestly like believe into a lie that the world isn't chaos, that like you could control bad things if you just have your vibes right or whatever, that you could manifest things and it'll just happen for you because you're spiritual enough. To me, that's also seems like deep fear and wanting to have a sense of control, but at the expense of everyone else. So it's the opposite of spirituality to me. No one is free until everyone is free, right? And to me, that is the most spiritual. That is like the heart of what it means to be a spiritual person to me, to live into that.
I really appreciate that reflection, Erin, and for a few different reasons. I posted on my IG story this morning, and I hadn't thought about bringing that here, but I think that it's just an interesting segue from what you said, but then also into our next question. Um, I posted that Trisha Hershey, the founder of the NAP Ministry, recently released her Rest deck and book. And I would say since she's been doing that kind of work, I've definitely seen like white women in like yoga, therapy, coaching, like co-opt that language of rest. But it seems like since she released the deck and the book, I've just seen a lot more white women, it feels like, telling other white women to rest. And I have a problem with that. And so when we talk about like the spiritual being political and it being interconnected, for me, that is an example. Because I don't think white women need to rest. I don't. That's not the direction. It needs to be some work going on. And we could literally tie that to politics related to voting and how we've seen, white women vote. And all of that is still this conversation, right? Exactly what you just said, Erin. The ability to be so disconnected, from your own humanity, not seeing how you're literally voting against yourself, you know. Um, I don't know. That's all I'm gonna say about that. I didn't really have like I guess a
Listen,
cohesive
you
thought to share about
you
that,
just
but
dropped the mic. You were like, y'all don't need to rest. Y'all don't need to rest. No, not at all. I mean, I think it's interesting. We're all been trained as social workers, and I don't want to project this, but I've said this in earlier episodes. Like, I went to a school that was largely dominated by white women. It was not that many of us, but we also know historically our profession is made up of white women, right? And so, this idea of like resting, I mean, I guess one of the things I struggle with, and I'm learning, I'm really trying my best, is like there's this way that like lineages get appropriated, like things that we learn. Like in school, we learned, right? We're supposed to cite everything, right? We're supposed to cite, try to avoid plagiarism. But it feels like in the social media world, it's like okay, it's okay to just steal people's like, actually, yeah, act like it's our words. And to me, that's very like spiritual and political as disembodied, because if we held spirituality and the political as interconnected, we would be making more room for honoring where we're learning these things from. Like it's important, it's appropriate. It's not, it's actually not cool. And I agree with you, Sequoia. I do feel like there's a lot of, but this is not new. Like the self-care thing always pisses me off because it's been appropriated, misnamed, misused, misabused. When Audre Lorde was talking about it, trying to survive cancer, you know what I mean? Like it was the last page in her cancer journals. And I've always been pissed off about that because it's just like, wow, like this Black woman was talking about cancer and not that many people were talking about it in the 90s. And if they were, it was coming from a very bypassy way. Like I survived cancer, and Audre was very honest about how complicated it was navigating medical racism, and that self-care for her was collective and it was deeply spiritual and political. And so to see her words be appropriated and misused, and just really, I mean, I feel like self-care has been ruined for me. I don't know about y'all, but I don't even like dare use the word. It feels like the name that goes unnamed, like Harry Potter. Like I just don't, it doesn't, it's like it was appropriated by Black folks because it was taken from Audre Lorde's words. Like self-preservation's an act, that's all Audre, and nobody cited her. Rarely did anybody give any credit. Rarely did anybody talk about where they got it from because they probably just Googled it. But we don't live in a culture that really, and it's really concerning, but we just don't live in a culture that makes room for like, hey, I learned this from somebody. Let me give credit to this person. Or this is a part of my lineage now. Like I really respect that I learned this from the Nat minister, or who actually studied theology. Like she's literally a minister, like this is her ministry, right? And so it's who's also like in any way, I mean, I would say that that work is spiritual as political approach. But yeah, we don't, yeah, it's very frustrating. I think we can have so many episodes on this topic. And I think a lot of it when it comes to social work pisses me off because we do it a lot in our work. I also don't know what it means to be a therapist in this day and age when there so much language that gets used around, like therapy language is all over the social media world. And Sequoia and I just off the grid, we're always like, oh, that's interesting. Like this person, like it's clear that they read it and they put it in a post, or like it's very clear, but these people have all these followers, right? And so there's even that, what does it mean when there's certain things that get repurposed to sell something, to make money off of people's pain? It just feels really frustrating. The other piece that it made me think of was Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith. I think white people are really in bad faith when they don't do their shadow work, when they don't really look at themselves. But the same goes for BIPOC folks or anybody really who doesn't see the spiritual as political, because you need to do shadow work. Unlearning is a part of shadow work. Decolonization is a part of shadow work. And when we're not doing that deep inner work, we're living in bad faith. We just are. And it's really tricky and complicated, but also dangerous if we don't really look at ourselves. Like it feels really dangerous. And the stakes feel really high if we don't look at the spiritual and political as interconnected. I'll stop there.
Yes, 1,000 times yes on everything you're saying, Biani. It just, and like what you were saying earlier, Erin, about like appropriation and even Sequoia, like, I very briefly, like I taught a tarot and therapy training, and before, and like with the sponsoring org who like, yeah, we want you to do this, like we love your values, you embody our social work values. I'm like, cool. And like months before the training, like I got this inappropriate comment from someone saying that I was contributing to turning our profession into a circus show. And I was like, whoa, whoa. The facilitator was like, do you want to know this person's name? I'm like, no, I don't, but I will put the disclaimer in my training and whatever. Will you please come to the Zoom training in case someone's going to start something, please? The fact that I had to think of a little bit about my safety as like a woman of color doing this was very interesting. Um, and like I didn't realize until like a couple months later like how much that comment hurt. I was like, my people were put on display in cages like a zoo for the World's Fair. Like, I wonder if that person knew that history. But I still did the training, right? Like, I still showed up, right? I unlearned like the fact that I shouldn't be allowed to do this. I am allowed. Like, I'm giving myself permission, and I did it. And like, made tons of community because of holding a training like that. So, yeah, it's real.
Thank you so much for sharing that experience, Michelle. You know, I I feel like, we have just really talked about again just the different ways that this can show up, how it's political. I am extremely sorry that you had that experience. Um, and I know that when folks feel like their structures are being questioned or systems are being questioned, right? It brings out a lot of different dynamics, and what you were talking about, Biani, feels like, just that shift from individual to collective, or like highlighting, individual to collective thinking, or orientation. Um, and I feel like, Michelle, what you offered was really interesting to get us into our last, kind of question, which are, do you all have any practical tips for incorporating, unlearning into you all's everyday lives and spiritual practices, and really thinking about this piece on the spiritual is political. Any practical tips or suggestions as to how folks can, incorporate that?
I can start and say, I think for your white listeners in particular, and also the acknowledgement that white supremacy culture is everywhere, so it's in all of our systems and it impacts everyone. And this is me now talking to white folks maybe listening. I think whatever your practice is, like your social work focus is, whether it's mental health or it's advocacy or systems work or case management or all of the myriad ways that social work shows up, that you go out of your way to learn from folks who are, the word decolonization was used a lot today. I think that's really important. Like learning from, I don't know that I can decolonize anything as a white person, but I can learn about how whiteness has shaped my experience, my practice, and the metrics and competencies that are just, that are created for the practice. And to really like seek out BIPOC practitioners, writing and work that already exists, not to DM them and ask them to do work for me, but to look at what already exists, that would reinterpret my work in a different way. So for me, that means, you spoke to it at the intro, Sequoia, as like, what does whiteness and white supremacy have to do with sort of modern science thinking around attachment theory? And what would it mean to decenter whiteness for me in my way I do that? Same with trauma-informed care, same with anything related to trauma, healing, and recovery. Really seeking to look for people who are rooted in that love ethic that you spoke about, Vianney, and to for me, part of my practice to integrate this into my daily life is someone giving me an explanation or coming from a professional expert standpoint. If it doesn't integrate the context of culture as healing, especially for people who've been cut off from their culture, but if it doesn't come from a context of culture and cultural knowing and cultural ways of making meaning, and if it doesn't have a political context, and if it doesn't look at how the current systems of oppression contribute to people's individual well-being as well as their systemic well-being, that it's a question to me. Like, put those glasses on. Is this trainer telling me something, like trying to make everyone's problems individual? Okay, I need to take this with a grain of salt, right? Like, having that lens is really helpful to me. And then I think the other thing from a surviving standpoint is that I think it was a unlearning for me, especially when I was, I mean, it's going to happen forever, but especially when I was younger in my career, is that, wow, opening my eyes truly to the suffering in the world once I get out of this binary thinking and supremacy thinking means I am, my own pain that I've experienced from the oppressions that I have, but also all of this oppression around me that comes from my ancestors and from me, myself. My eyes are now open to a lot of more suffering than they had been before. And so I have to hold on to the joy of this life, so that I really believe that the amount of sorrow that I bear witness to, that I experience in my own life and with other people, is the same amount of joy that I can experience. And I have to just hold so tightly to that, because I found the more I opened myself to the realities of oppression, the more deeply I could experience love and connection and joyfulness in a way that to me is deeply spiritual and makes it possible. So it's just like having your lens to interrogate, is whiteness the explanation here? So if so, I got to seek out some different perspectives down to the core, and then finding how I stay connected to joy so that I can keep my, I was going to say keep my eyes open, but then I think that might be ableist. So that I can stay aware of what's happening in a real way.
Man, I don't know how to follow that. So many good tips. I think when I was taking in information from like academia and things like that, I especially, and even before then, when I was learning about like anti-racism work or anti-oppression work, I always paid attention to like my feelings when I was reading things, when reading information. It's like, what's going on in my nervous system? Like, why does this one phrase make my stomach turn? Like, what's going on there? And so much of white supremacy culture is like, we just take in information at face value, the written word, worship of the written word, right? And there's so much other knowledge out there, right? Like, as a Filipino, like, I didn't learn about my history in the books in school. Like, I had to look for that, like really had to look for that and look for it in other spaces outside of academia, spiritual spaces, activist spaces. What else? Really, everything that, all healing has like an indigenous history. So like really taking the time to find out what that history is and crediting it and like paying reparations of whatever kind to it is very important as well. What else? I mean, like, it's interesting because like people like especially with like coaches and like TikTok influencers, like they're like, here's the product, right? That's like the product can be as simple as, I don't know, you having an altar in your room, or like you just like doing a journal reflection. Like, that's already spiritual enough, like we can be as basic as that.
Thank
I love
you.
that.
Ooh, sorry. Yeah,
Go
sorry. Yeah.
ahead. Go ahead, Brianna.
I love that. I appreciate like the tips that y'all shared. For those who are watching, you might want to pause, rewind it, whatever, like watch it again, take notes. Because it's true. I think that's really true. A lot of what y'all offered is medicine that people can use like as soon as they get out, they finish watching this. So thank you. So I know we're almost at the end. So right, Sequoia, I just want to honor that. So why don't y'all tell us a little bit, like as we come to a close before we share main takeaways, like what are your like current offerings that you'd like to share with us, and also let us know where people can find you, whether it's socials, website, like a way that they can reach you. Whoever wants to go first, welcome to.
How I go, and then we can end on Michelle. Does that sound okay? So my Instagram is journal.as.alter, That's my handle. And I also have a website, it's just journalsalter.com. And right now on the website, I offer a pre-recorded workshop about some of the basic concepts around keeping a journal as an altar. There's a lot integrated in actually about politics and about undoing binary thinking and perfectionism as they show up in our creative practices. And that's really a vehicle to get us to the conversation, frankly, that we're having today. So that's available, and there'll be future recorded offerings. I also have a Substack community called This Page is a Portal that you can join as a free or paid subscriber, and I offer lots of like self-reflection, journaling prompts, creative inspiration, and just reflections from my own journals. And they often are fairly political because that's just who I am, or at least social justice is a big part of it. And then my consulting website for my work more specific to trauma recovery, healing, system-based work consulting is collectiveactionconsulting.com, and people can also reach out to me that way. I do a fair amount of work around with organizations that if they have social service provision related to any type of violence, particularly with domestic violence, but any type of violence, I do a lot of work supporting organizations to get closer to their missions through the way they treat each other internally. And a lot of that is rooted in, social justice focused community care approach to trauma-informed care. And I'll just say thank you for having me. This conversation is so exciting.
You can find, I have a Wix website. My practice name is Banshee Therapy Services, like the screaming banshee. And I actually just did it at another podcast interview a couple of weeks ago, and you can find it on there. It's about turning passion into practice through the Activated Life podcast. I also will be having another podcast episode released later in the year about psychology and social work with the Hot Girls Healing podcast, another amazing local Seattle podcast. And I am working on offering tarot readings. I used to do them informally and at my local crystal shops, but I want to do that again at some point. So I will be working on trying to put that into my website. But other than that, you can find me on Psych Today. I'm not taking new clients, but you can find me there.
Thank you both so much. Really, really grateful. So this is a part of our segment where we share like our takeaways from today's episode. And I'd love to hear from Sequoia, like what your takeaway is, or if anybody wants to like share a takeaway, please. Something that, you're taking with you from this experience today, or what stood out to you. Actually, let me go first too, just in the interest of time, and then I'll pass it to Sequoia. Sorry. I am really sitting with some of the like hot fire gems y'all all spit. Like Sequoia, I'm still like, yes, y'all don't need to rest. That one takes the cake for me. Yes, white women don't need to rest. Y'all need to work. That's my takeaway. Over to you, Sequoia.
For folks that are listening to us on Spotify and some of our other like audio-based platforms, I was dying laughing while Biani was saying that last part. Yeah, my main takeaway honestly is I really enjoyed, like, what keeps flashing in front of in front of my eyes is the High Priestess card that you shared, Michelle. Like, I cannot get that image like out of my head for some reason. So I am sitting with that. There was something very and Erin used the word grounding. Um I guess it was grounding. It's just staying with me for some reason. So I just feel like I need to figure out what that is. So I greatly appreciate, that share. Thank you. Because we love a share and tell. We love a share and tell moment. So thank you.
I would say that I'm also really taking white women don't need to rest. We need to work. We need to do more. And amen. And also, Michelle, kind of paired with that, actually, really strong for me is when you said all healing is indigenous or comes from an indigenous place or indigenous practice, that felt really like a mic drop to me. And I think those two things being paired together for me is what I'm going to take and think about in my own practice and reflect on, as well as Biani. I think when you spoke about, again, about the love ethic and also about good faith and bad faith kind of practice and being, those three for me, those three gems are I'm gonna do some journaling about what it would mean to think about integrating that personally, because that feels like a lot to work with. That feels really powerful.
My takeaways are very similar. I don't know if you saw me, Sequoia, but when you said white women don't need to rest, they need to work, like I literally snorted. I was like, it's so true, right? I'm laughing because it's true. And so, yeah, that was just a moment. My ancestors were like, you need to listen to that. And I was like, okay. And also Sequoia, or sorry, Biani, what you said earlier about just like the self-care quote that gets appropriated from Audre Lorde. And just, I honestly didn't know that history. So I'm going to take that with me and integrate it whenever I share it in my practice with clients, because I think it's really important to learn that very nuanced history. Yeah, and then Erin, just everything you said about like disembodiment and like unlearning whiteness, like it just, so glad that there are so many more like allies in the making like you around.
This was wonderful. Thank you all so much for being with us today. We're going to keep this conversation going. Please make sure that you share your thoughts or questions in the comment section. We love to hear from you. And as you all know, we'll be back in 2 weeks. And we are excited to again keep talking about unlearning, continue our spiritual practitioners answer series. And in 2 weeks, we're going to come back together for episode 18. Spiritual Practitioners Answer is Unlearning the Key to Unlocking Your Professional Potential. That's going to be Monday, May 15th, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. As always, just so that y'all know what next week or in 2 weeks is going to be about. Unlearning is a critical part of our journey as spiritual therapists and practitioners. We cannot continue to be passive in our pursuit of doing care work that is rooted in upholding oppression and supremacy culture. Unlearning calls for us to do the work of reclamation. We deserve to be our authentic selves, both personally and professionally. So, as mentioned, we're going to be joined by two guest spiritual practitioners and healers, Brandy and Jesse. So, we will see you all then.
And y'all, thank you so much for being in community with us and supporting a heart-centered podcast by two queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, social work, mental health, and everything in between. We'd love to stay connected and build and continue to build the spiritualpreneur and healing community. So please subscribe to our page, our YouTube channel, our Reclaiming Soul Work podcast. Once you subscribe, you can set a reminder for notifications when we release an episode. You can also sign up at our landing page on our website to be notified of future episodes and offerings. And yeah, stay connected. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you all
Thank you
so
again,
much.
Erin and Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.